In the year 70 AD, Roman legions sacked and burned Jerusalem. Israel would remain a nation in exile for nearly 2,000 years. But in the aftermath of World War II, the people of the book returned home. Israel's rebirth and survival in the 20th century has often been called a miracle. Those who were there cite their own experiences as proof. I'm Michael Greenspan. I'm an investigative journalist. These are their stories.
It's impossible for anyone young, for anyone who, for that matter, was not here, to imagine what this place was like before Israel became a nation again in 1948. It was only in 1909 that the Turks allowed Tel Aviv to come into existence as an all-Jewish community. Even then, it was just a small backwater town. The American writer and philosopher Mark Twain paid a visit here in 1867, and here's what he said. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes, desolate and unlovely. Those that did come here faced a harsh land and unfriendly neighbors. But slowly they pushed back the desert and brought life out of the desolation they found. New Jewish towns and villages appeared across Palestine. Fields and orchards grew where none had been in 2,000 years. When Britain inherited Palestine and the spoils of World War I, Lord Balfour declared that this should become a Jewish homeland. But that was a declaration without substance until the world witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust on millions of Jews, and the newly formed United Nations passed a resolution affirming it.
The United States adheres to the view stated in the Security Council on March 19, and which was reaffirmed by the Secretary of State on March 20, and again by the President of the United States on March 25, that a temporary trusteeship should be established to maintain the peace.
By then, British political will had shifted to maintaining the status quo. The British Navy attempted to stop all Jewish immigration and turn back any ship that reached the harbors off Palestine's coast. British officers trained and equipped militias of the Arab League in an attempt to empower Arab suppression of mounting Jewish claims for independence. England became an enemy of the Jews, and the Jews were determined to drive the British from what they now considered to be their rightful homeland. Young Jews joined groups like Irgun and the Palmach to wage a guerrilla war against British occupation.
So what could a bunch of mostly untrained young men, many of them only teenagers, actually do against the mighty British Army?
Haifa Harbor, Palestine. An oil fire, admittedly started by terrorists, the so-called Stern Gang, rages along a quarter-mile of waterfront.
The terrorists try to force a showdown by blowing up British headquarters. 80 soldiers are dead, many others maimed.
Blown up by terrorists is a British officers' club. The most far-reaching blast in its consequences since the destruction of the King David Hotel last summer. 16 are dead.
The Jewish freedom fighters had one goal: to make governing Palestine so miserable for the British, they would want to leave. The English finally had enough.
I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
One of those young Jewish freedom fighters who helped drive the British from Palestine was a teenager named Ezra. His story recalls an account in the Bible of God blinding the eyes of those who would have harmed Abraham's nephew. Ezra, when you were a young man, a teenager,
yeah,
you did something that most American teenagers wouldn't do. You went off to join the underground.
when my parents found out, it was terrible. I made them understand that I'm decisive. When they understood that, all they could do is to pray for me. And they'll never forget. Every time I went down the steps, getting out of our home, I've heard my mother whispering a prayer. Go in peace and come back in peace, and let the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, blind your enemies so they won't see what you do. And I want to tell you, this prayer was received in the skies in a stunning way. So many times my life was saved miraculously.
שלום. שמעון מיכאל, אני מצטער. אני צריך הלילה רק 3. אברהם, עזרא וציון. אז אתם הולכים הביתה. בסדר? נקרא לכם פעם הבאה. חברים, מחר ב6 בבוקר אנחנו תוקפים שיירת סיור בריטית בדרך לירושלים. יש לנו כאן בשקים רימוני יד, רובים וחלקים של מקלע ברן חדש. תרכיבו אותו כשתגיעו לשטח. ליד הכביש במקום שבו השיירה עוברת יש בניין ריק. נתקוף משם. הכל ברור? כן. טוב, אז נתראה בעוד כמה שעות. הצלחה.
One thing we didn't know, that the British imposed a sudden curfew. They intended to hang 2 of my friends, and they feared that we, the underground, will manage to kidnap British soldiers. It was a dark night. Once we started walking, we faced through the dark British troops approaching. We tried to escape from this group. We found ourselves approaching to other group. The only thing we could think about was the gallows. But not yet, not yet, not yet. Suddenly we heard shooting. Next day found out the reason. Quite near, a poor man, father of 10 children, Mizrahi was his name, Abud Mizrahi. He was shot to death. He didn't know about the curfew, and that was his destiny. We were sure they see us. We were so near, and we were quite obvious. We were boys carrying sacks, and miraculously they didn't see us.
חלקים. זה הפוך. טוב.
We looked through the window and we saw masses of troops jumping from trucks and storming over the houses, coming to search.
כל עוד בלב! תוציאו מטוס. הם יבואו לכאן, הם יראו את הנשק, הם יוציאו אותנו להורג. אני רוצה שהם יבינו למה אנחנו עושים את זה. אני רוצה שהם ידעו למה אנחנו כאן. כל עוד בלב! יש לי רעיון יותר טוב. מה? אבל זה תלוי בשלושתנו. אתם זוכרים את מות שמשון, תמות נפשי עם פלישתים? הם יבואו לכאן ואין לנו סיכוי נגדם. אבל הם ישלמו ביוקר עבור החיים שלנו. צודק. מסכימים? קדימה. כנסו לעמדות, תהיו מוכנים.
You can imagine the tension in such a state. And you've heard them approaching, and every step made them closer to us. And then you've heard them getting in the corridor and knocking hardly on a door next to our door. It was right behind our wall, right next to our room. They searched, they moved the table, and they closed it, and they opened the drawers, and they turned the mattresses, and they knocked on the floor. And this time, I thought soon they come to us. And all kind of memories came to my mind, what I expected from my life and what's going on. And the more I thought, the more my heart was beating harder and harder, and I felt suddenly my body trembling from excitement. I didn't join the underground to kill myself, but I knew I was ready, I knew the dangers, and if this is the end. But then when I glanced to my friends, this was much harder. I couldn't believe that a man can love a human as I loved them in that moment, as I loved my friends.
Well?
They're not here, sir. We've searched everywhere.
Check the night patrols. Somebody should have seen them. Meet me downstairs.
Yes, sir.
Let's go!
I thought, my God, it must be that this guy called them for breakfast. Now we'll have to wait till they finish eating. And suddenly we've heard on the outside voices of children. You know how children, when they play loudly and so on. I thought, how come their parents let them get out? Then you've heard their vehicles getting further, and understood the British left. The British searched everywhere. There were places they turned everything. There were places they broke walls. Our room was the only place they missed.
Once again, though, you were invisible.
Yeah.
This happened to you several times in one day. You were invisible. Is this the land of miracles, Ezra?
I won't talk about miracles. I say there's a promise. And there's a covenant. I feel part of it.
In the search for miracles here, there is no better place to look than the very existence of Israel itself. That it ever came into being, that once declared it survived at all, is beyond belief. It gives new meaning to the slogan, "Against all odds."
As 1917 began, the world was still engulfed in what many were calling the war to end all wars. England and her allies were facing an acute shortage of explosives until a patriotic Jewish scientist named Chaim Weizmann approached the British government with a formula he had devised for TNT. It became a pivotal factor in turning the tide of the war. Refusing a proposed royal honor for his service to the crown, he instead asked that something be done for his people, the Jews, in exile from their homeland around the world. That something was truly explosive.
On November 2nd, 1917, while the world was still in the throes of a world war, Baron Lord Rothschild received a letter from London. It was brief.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this objective. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour.
Those powerful words became a mighty wind that swept through worldwide Jewry, fueling Zionist fires of hope that after 2,000 years, the exiled nation of Israel would again have a home in the land of David. 1 month later, on December 11, 1917, British General Edmund Allenby accepted the surrender of Jerusalem from the Turks, who had held the Holy City captive for more than 400 years. The month following, Chaim Weizmann, who would eventually become Israel's first president, met with Faisal Hussein, king of Iraq and Syria. King Hussein wrote in Mecca's Al-Qibla that year,
"The resources of the country are still virgin soil and will be developed by the Jewish immigrants."
A year later, the king officially executed a treaty with a Zionist organization. At the Paris Peace Conference, which officially ended World War I, he wrote,
"We Arabs, especially the educated among us, look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. Our delegation here in Paris regard them as moderate and proper."
The League of Nations ratified the Balfour Declaration, and at the request of the Jewish delegation, assigned to Great Britain a mandate to carry out the declaration's aim of establishing the Jewish national home in Palestine. But Jewish trust in British friendship was about to be shattered. London had its own aims for the Middle East, to create a pan-Arab union of nations dependent on Britain. A Jewish state would be uncontrollable and independent. Britain reversed its support of the Balfour Declaration and now opposed Zionist goals of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1939, Sir Winston Churchill cautioned, "The acts that we engage in for appeasement today, we will have to remedy at far greater cost and remorse tomorrow." The British government issued a white paper in 1939, declaring its abandonment of the Zionist policy. 75,000 more Jews would be allowed into Palestine over the next 5 years, and then the gates would be permanently closed. Britain implemented the White Paper's provisions, in effect trapping untold numbers of Jews in Nazi Europe who might have otherwise escaped even during the war. To ensure their policy was carried out, the British Royal Air Force and Navy instituted a blockade around Palestine. No Jewish immigrant was allowed in. Those who defied the blockade were called illegals, and there were thousands of them. Desperate men and women and children, risking everything to escape the Nazi ovens. A courageous few made it through, but most suffered a different fate. The little-known and tragic story of the Struma is typical. Escaping Hitler's ovens with 769 Jews on board, an aging cattle cargo barge named the Struma sailed from Constanza in Romania on December 12, 1941. 3 days later, just as the engine failed, the ship arrived in Istanbul, in Turkey. The Turks refused to let them repair the engine and would not let them land, citing security restrictions. The British ambassador was more direct, firmly stating that his government did not want these people in Palestine. After 2 months of quarantine in the Istanbul harbor, the Struma was refused further sanctuary, and though it was unseaworthy, it was sent back out to sea. Still within sight of the harbor, an enormous explosion ripped through the doomed ship from a Russian torpedo. The Struma sank, with all 769 souls aboard, save one. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been exterminated by the Nazi Holocaust. World sympathies toward the Jews forced the newly formed United Nations to face the Palestinian issue. On November 29, 1947, the UN passed Resolution number 181, proposing the partitioning of the British Mandate territory into 2 states, Jewish and Arab.
Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Argentina? Abstention. Egypt? No. Soviet Union? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The plan was only a shadow of the promise of 30 years before. With few friends in power, the Zionist leaders accepted the plan. The Arab states rejected it.
The holy city of Jerusalem is a scene of bloodshed and terror as the United Nations division of Palestine inflames violence between Arab and Jew. Burning, shooting, and pillaging mark the beginning of the partitioning. Youths of Haganah, Jewish military organization, try to salvage merchandise from looters in the mixed area of the city. 91 lives are lost in the first few days. The British are to start evacuating their army in May. The 7 nations of the Arab High Council plan organized resistance to the partitioning. Haganah swears it will not be intimidated.
And so, the stage was set. On May 14, 1948, the British Mandate officially ended. That morning, the Jewish People's Council gathered at the Tel Aviv Museum to sign a proclamation read by David Ben-Gurion, officially declaring the sovereignty of a new Jewish state as of midnight that night. 11 minutes later, the United States officially recognized the new nation of Israel. It's so quiet now, but on the morning of May 14, 1948, the air in this room was electric. This was the final crossroads. From this moment, there was no going back. Everyone knew that they could, and in fact many would, pay with their lives for what they were about to do. Yet they remained committed to a course of freedom and independence, for the rebirth of their nation after 2,000 years in exile. And so they signed their names and their lives to whatever lay ahead. That Israel survived that first day, that these people went on to build their nation despite enduring incredible hardships, and in defiance of enemies dedicated to their annihilation, may be the greatest living evidence in our time of the reality of miracles.